Elizabeth Morgan stood in the vast attic of her grandmother's Hamptons estate, dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight that filtered through the dormer windows. At 32, she had finally returned to claim her inheritance, a sprawling, beachfront mansion worth millions, left to her after her grandmother's passing last month. The old Victorian home had been in the Morgan family for generations, housing oil tycoons and Wall Street moguls alike. Elizabeth had spent summers here as a child, but had been estranged from her family for the past decade, a painful rift caused by her refusal to follow the family tradition of entering finance, choosing instead a career as a photojournalist. "Miss Morgan, would you like me to help with these boxes?" called Geoffrey, the family's longtime butler who had stayed with the estate. "No, thank you," Elizabeth replied, pushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "I'd like to do this alone." The attic held countless treasures, antique furnishings, trunks filled with vintage Chanel and Dior gowns her grandmother had worn to galas, and dozens of leather-bound family albums. Elizabeth settled onto an ornate Persian rug, pulling a particularly old album into her lap. The leather was cracked with age, the gold leaf embossing barely visible. Morgan family, 1960 to 1965. Elizabeth's fingers trembled slightly as she opened. Her mother had been born in 1961, and Elizabeth had few photos of her as a child. Perhaps she would find something to connect her to the mother she'd lost to cancer when she was just 16. She flipped through pages of black and white photographs. Her grandparents at charity events, sailing on their yacht, hosting politicians and celebrities at lavish garden parties. The wealth on display was staggering diamonds glittering at her grandmother's throat, her grandfather's hand resting casually on the hood of a Rolls-Royce. Elizabeth turned another page and froze. There, in a photograph dated July 1963, was a young woman in her 20s standing beside her grandfather on the estate's grand staircase. She wore a simple white dress, her auburn hair falling in waves around her shoulders, her smile hesitant but warm. The resemblance was uncanny, the same almond-shaped eyes Elizabeth saw in the mirror every day, the same high cheekbones, the same slightly crooked smile. Elizabeth's heart raced. This couldn't be her mother, who would have been only 2 years old in 1963. It wasn't her grandmother, whose photographs appeared throughout the album. This was someone else entirely, someone who could have been Elizabeth's twin. With shaking hands, she carefully removed the photograph and turned it over. In faded blue ink, someone had written, "Richard and Carolyn, summer 1963. Carolyn." The name was unfamiliar. Elizabeth had never heard of a Carolyn in the family. Outside, thunder rumbled as storm clouds gathered over the Atlantic. The attic suddenly felt colder, the shadows longer. Elizabeth clutched the photograph, her reporter's instinct telling her she had stumbled onto something significant, something deliberately hidden. Who was Carolyn? And why did she look exactly like Elizabeth? As rain began to lash against the windows, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that the answers would change everything she thought she knew about the Morgan family and herself. Elizabeth descended the grand staircase of the Morgan estate, photograph in hand, determined to find answers. The mansion echoed with the sound of rain against the windows, the storm outside matching the turbulence within her. "Geoffrey," she called, finding the butler meticulously arranging fresh lily in the foyer. "Do you know who this woman is?" The elderly butler adjusted his glasses and studied the photograph. His face, usually the perfect mask of professional composure, faltered for just a moment, but long enough for Elizabeth to notice. "I believe that's Miss Caroline Hayes," he said carefully, his voice measured. "She was a guest of the family for some time." "She looks exactly like me," Elizabeth pressed. "Was she related to us?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss family matters, Miss Morgan," Geoffrey replied, returning to his flowers. Perhaps you should speak with Mr. Sullivan. He's been the family attorney for 40 years. Within an hour, Elizabeth was driving her rented Mercedes through the rain-slicked streets of Southampton to the offices of Sullivan and Partners, housed in a colonial building on Main Street. James Sullivan, a silver-haired man in his 70s, greeted her with a warmth that seemed tinged with apprehension. "I wondered when you might come to see me about matters beyond the inheritance," he said, ushering her into a wood-paneled office, adorned with maritime paintings and legal tomes. Elizabeth placed the photograph on his desk. "Who is she?" Sullivan sighed, removing his glasses to polish them with a monogrammed handkerchief. "I was instructed to give you this only if you asked specific questions." He unlocked a drawer and removed a sealed envelope. "Your grandmother left this for you." With trembling fingers, Elizabeth broke the seal. Inside was a letter written in her grandmother's elegant script, along with a key. "My dearest Elizabeth," the letter began. "If you're reading this, you've discovered Caroline. The truth is complicated and painful. Caroline Hayes was your grandfather's mistress, a talented artist from a modest background whom he met at a gallery opening. Their affair lasted nearly 2 years. When she became pregnant in 1963, your grandfather paid her to disappear. She agreed, but insisted on keeping a single photograph as remembrance." Elizabeth's breath caught. Pregnant? Caroline gave birth to a daughter in early 1964. The letter continued. "A child your grandfather never acknowledged. That child was your mother, Catherine." The room seemed to spin around Elizabeth. Her mother wasn't the daughter of her grandmother, Eleanor, as she'd always believed. Her mother was the product of an affair, which meant Elizabeth herself was descended not from the Morgan matriarch, but from this mysterious Caroline. "The key opens a storage unit in Manhattan," Sullivan explained gently. "Your grandmother established it years ago. Inside are Caroline's paintings, letters, and personal effects. Eleanor tracked her down after your mother's death, feeling you deserved to know the truth someday." "My grandmother knew about this affair?" Elizabeth asked, stunned. "The upper echelons of society often operate on unspoken arrangements," Sullivan replied. "Eleanor tolerated your grandfather's indiscretions to maintain the family name and fortune. But when Catherine, your mother, grew to look exactly like Caroline, the resemblance became impossible to ignore. That's why your grandmother was always distant with your mother." Elizabeth sat back, pieces of her childhood suddenly making terrible sense. The tension at family gatherings, her grandmother's critical comments about her mother's common tendencies, the arguments she'd overheard but never understood. "Is Caroline still alive?" Elizabeth whispered, Sullivan's expression soft with sympathy. "That's what you'll need to discover for yourself. The address of the storage facility is in the envelope. What you do with what you find there is entirely up to you." As Elizabeth drove back to the estate, the rain finally ceased and a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds. She clutched the key in her palm, feeling as though she was holding the key not just to a storage unit, but to her own identity. The following morning, Elizabeth drove into Manhattan, the skyline gleaming in the post-storm sunlight. The storage facility was located in Chelsea, a high-security, climate-controlled building that catered to wealthy clients storing valuable art and antiquities. "Morgan Hayes' unit," Elizabeth told the attendant, presenting her ID and the key. The woman checked her clipboard and nodded. "Unit 317, top floor, private access." She handed Elizabeth an electronic keycard. "Your grandmother maintained this unit for 20 years. Paid in full through 2030. The elevator ascended silently." Elizabeth's heart pounded as the doors opened to reveal a sterile hallway with only 2 doors, one marked 317. She inserted the key, turned it, and heard the lock disengage with a soft click. The room beyond was not the cramped storage Space she had expected, but a pristine gallery. Track lighting illuminated a dozen large canvases hanging on the walls. In the center stood a glass display case containing journals, letters, and photographs. Near the window was a small seating area with a leather armchair and side table. Elizabeth moved slowly around the room, transfixed by the paintings. They were extraordinary, vibrant landscapes, intimate portraits, and abstract compositions that somehow conveyed profound emotion. Each was signed simply, C.H. Carolyn Hayes had been talented, extraordinarily so. One painting in particular drew Elizabeth closer, a self-portrait of Caroline in a sun-drenched studio, her auburn hair captured in precise brushstrokes, her eyes Elizabeth's eyes gazing directly at the viewer with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. Asterisk. "My God," Elizabeth whispered, touching her own face unconsciously. She moved to the display case and began examining its contents. There were exhibition catalogs from small galleries in the early 1960s featuring Caroline's work, newspaper clippings of reviews praising an emerging talent with extraordinary promise, and personal photographs, Carolyn on beaches, in European cafes, in her studio. And then, in a leather-bound journal dated 1963-1964, Elizabeth found what she was looking for. "Richard came to the gallery today," Carolyn had written in October 1963. "I told him about the baby. He was silent for a long time, then offered money, a substantial amount, to take care of the problem. When I refused, he became angry, then calculating. By the end of our conversation, he had proposed a different arrangement, financial security for life in exchange for my complete disappearance. I am to have the child in secret and never contact him again. I am to relinquish all claims to the Morgan name and fortune." Elizabeth turned the pages, her vision blurring with tears. "I've decided to accept Richard's terms," a later entry read. "Not for the money, though it will provide for my child, but because I cannot bear the thought of my baby being raised in that cold world of privilege without love. I've seen how Eleanor treats her sons like investments rather than children. My daughter deserves better. I will give her a different life, perhaps not as wealthy, but richer in the things that truly matter." The final pages revealed that Carolyn had moved to Paris after giving birth, establishing herself in the art scene there. She had named her daughter Catherine, the same name Elizabeth's mother had carried. But the most shocking discovery lay in a sealed envelope tucked into the journal's back pocket. Inside was a letter dated just 5 years ago, addressed to Eleanor Morgan. "I was surprised to receive your letter after all these years," Caroline had written. "Yes, I am still living in Paris, though I spend winters in my house in Provence. I understand your desire to finally meet your granddaughter Catherine, but as you know, she passed away 16 years ago from breast cancer. However, I would very much like to meet my granddaughter Elizabeth someday, when you feel the time is right to tell her the truth about her heritage." Elizabeth sank into the leather armchair, the letter clutched to her chest. Caroline Hayes, her biological grandmother, was still alive, living in France. Wanting to meet her, among the papers in the display case was a small business card with Paris address and phone number preserved under glass. With shaking hands, Elizabeth took out her phone and dialed the international number, not knowing what she would say if someone answered, not knowing if the number was even still in service. After 5 years, 3 rings, then 4. Elizabeth was about to hang up when she heard a click, followed by a woman's voice, aged but clear, speaking in French-accented English. "Hello? Who is calling, please?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "My name is Elizabeth Morgan. I believe you might be my grandmother." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. "Elizabeth," the voice finally responded, soft with wonder. At last, that single conversation changed everything. 3 days later, Elizabeth found herself on a first-class flight to Paris, a family album and Caroline's journal tucked safely in her carry-on bag. The Morgan estate and its complications felt a world away as she gazed out the airplane window at the Atlantic passing beneath her. In the quiet luxury of the first-class cabin, Elizabeth read through the journal again, absorbing Caroline's story. After leaving New York, Caroline had used Richard Morgan's money to establish herself in Paris's vibrant Montparnasse district. There, she had raised Catherine in a bohemian apartment above a cafe, surrounded by artists and intellectuals. According to the journal, Catherine had shown artistic talent from an early age. Caroline had documented her daughter's childhood with the detailed eye of both an artist and a devoted mother. Catherine's first steps in Luxembourg Gardens, her first painting. At age 4, her delight at feeding pigeons in front of Notre Dame. Elizabeth was moved to tears, reading about the mother she had lost too soon, a version of her mother she had never known. The Catherine that Caroline described was free-spirited and passionate, so different from the reserved, sometimes melancholy woman who had married Elizabeth's father, a junior executive at Morgan Financial, in what now appeared to have been a calculated match engineered by the Morgan family to bring their biological granddaughter back into the fold. The plane landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport as the sun was setting over Paris. Elizabeth collected her luggage and found a chauffeur waiting, holding a sign with her name. "Madame Hayes sent me," the driver explained in accented English, taking her bags. "She is most eager to meet you." They drove through the twilight streets of Paris, crossing the Seine where the Eiffel Tower stood illuminated against the darkening sky. Elizabeth felt a strange sense of homecoming as they entered the 6th arrondissement and pulled up before an elegant Haussmannian building with wrought-iron balconies adorned with overflowing flower boxes. The driver carried her bags to the 3rd floor, where a door opened before they could knock. Elizabeth found herself face to face with Caroline Hayes. At 85, Caroline was still striking. Her once auburn hair had faded to silver, elegantly coiffed around a face lined with age, yet remarkably vibrant. She wore a simple black dress with a single strand of pearls, tasteful, understated luxury. But it was her eyes that arrested Elizabeth. Same shape and unusual amber color as her own, now wide with emotion. "You look just like her," Caroline whispered, raising a trembling hand to Elizabeth's cheek. "Just like Catherine." They embraced wordlessly, two strangers connected by blood and loss, by secrets and shared features. When they finally separated, both wiping away tears, Caroline led Elizabeth into a spacious apartment with high ceilings and tall windows overlooking a quiet courtyard. The walls were covered with paintings, Caroline's work spanning decades, charting her evolution as an artist. "Welcome home, my dear," Caroline said, gesturing to a beautifully set table by the window where dinner awaited. A bottle of champagne chilled in a silver bucket. "I've waited for this moment for so long." Over an exquisite meal of coq au vin and fine Bordeaux, Caroline began filling in the gaps of Elizabeth's fractured family history. She spoke of her passionate affair with Richard Morgan, of her heartbreak when he chose wealth and status over love, of her determination to give Catherine a life rich in experience rather than material wealth. "Your mother knew everything," Caroline revealed, refilling their glasses. "When she turned 18, I told her about her father, offered to help her meet him if she wished. She declined. But then, at 22, she made a decision that shocked me. She applied for a position at Morgan Financial, using her talent with numbers. She wanted, I think, to see this other world for herself." "Where she met my father," Elizabeth said softly. Caroline nodded. "When she told me she was marrying James Bennet, I was devastated. I knew the Morgans had orchestrated it. James was their protégé. They were reclaiming their bloodline without acknowledging it. But why would my mother agree to it?" Caroline smiled sadly. Love, perhaps, or curiosity, or the desire to provide a more stable life for any children she might have. She reached across the table to take Elizabeth's hand. What matters is that she loved you fiercely. When she became ill, her only regret was leaving you alone. I wasn't entirely alone, Elizabeth said. I had my father. Yes, Carolyn acknowledged. James was a good man caught in a complex situation. Did he ever remarry after Catherine's death? Elizabeth shook her head. No, he raised me alone. He died just 2 years ago, heart attack. Silence fell between them, comfortable yet charged with unspoken questions. Outside, Paris had transformed into a glittering nightscape, the sounds of the city a gentle backdrop to their reunion. Tomorrow, Carolyn said finally, I have much more to show you. But tonight, rest. Your room is prepared the same room your mother used whenever she visited. Elizabeth's heart skipped. My mother visited you? Even after marrying into the Morgan circle? Caroline's smile was tinged with mischief. My dear, there was much more rebellion in your mother than the Morgans ever suspected. Now come, let me show you to your room. Elizabeth awoke to sunlight streaming through tall windows and the distant sounds of Parisian streets coming to life. For a moment she was disoriented, until memories of the previous day came rushing back. She was in her mother's room in Caroline's apartment, surrounded by evidence of a life she had never known existed. The room was a testament to Catherine's dual existence. On the bookshelf stood framed photographs of her mother as a young woman in Paris, laughing with friends at sidewalk cafes, painting in a sun-drenched studio, swimming in the Mediterranean, alongside the more familiar images of Catherine as Elizabeth had known her, poised, reserved, dressed in the understated luxury befitting a Morgan connection. On the desk lay a leather portfolio that Elizabeth hadn't noticed the night before. She opened it to find dozens of sketches and watercolors signed K.H. Catherine Hayes, the artist her mother had been before becoming Catherine Bennett, wife of a Morgan executive. Elizabeth dressed quickly and found Caroline in the kitchen, preparing coffee and croissants. I see you discovered Catherine's portfolio, Caroline observed, noting the emotion in Elizabeth's eyes. She continued to paint whenever she visited Paris. Her work became her secret rebellion against the constraints of Morgan life. Over breakfast, Caroline revealed the extent of Catherine's double life. Twice yearly, Catherine would tell her husband and the Morgans she was attending art appreciation courses in Europe, technically true, as she would visit museums and galleries. But primarily she was reconnecting with her mother and her artistic roots. The summer you were 12, Caroline said, your mother brought you to Paris. Do you remember? Elizabeth frowned. I remember a trip to France with my mother, but I thought we stayed in hotels the entire time. You spent 3 days here in this apartment. Caroline smiled. Your mother introduced me as an old family friend, an artist, who would teach you to paint. You were so talented, even then. Memories suddenly resurfaced, sitting at an easel on a Parisian balcony. An elegant older woman guiding her hand, the scent of oil paints and turpentine. That was you, Elizabeth whispered. I painted a view of the rooftops. Indeed you did. Caroline rose and disappeared into another room, returning with a small canvas that Elizabeth immediately recognized as her own childhood work. Catherine wanted you to know this side of your heritage, even if she couldn't reveal the whole truth. The revelation left Elizabeth reeling. Why didn't she ever tell me? After my grandmother Eleanor died, there was nothing stopping her. Caroline's expression darkened. By then, she was already ill. She didn't want to burden you with complicated truths when you were facing the prospect of losing her. She made me promise to wait until you were ready, truly ready to learn everything. After breakfast, Caroline led Elizabeth to her private studio, A large room at the back of the apartment flooded with northern light. Here hung Caroline's most personal works, including a striking portrait of Catherine in her 30s, looking remarkably like Elizabeth did now. "I painted this the last time she visited before her diagnosis," Caroline explained, her voice catching. She knew something was wrong by then, though she hadn't seen doctors yet. From a locked cabinet, Caroline retrieved a rosewood box. "Catherine left this for you. She asked that I give it to you when the time came." Inside the box lay a letter sealed with wax, a vintage Cartier watch, and a small velvet pouch. Elizabeth opened the letter with trembling fingers, recognizing her mother's handwriting. "My dearest Elizabeth, if you're reading this, you've discovered the truth about our family. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you myself, but please understand that my silence was meant to protect you from the complications that defined my own life. The watch belonged to my mother, Caroline. The diamonds were purchased with the first money she earned from selling her paintings in Paris. It represents her independence and strength, qualities I hope I've passed to you. In the pouch is something else, something I took from the Morgan estate the day I learned I was dying. It rightfully belongs to our bloodline, though the Morgans would disagree." Elizabeth opened the pouch and gasped. Inside was an exquisite emerald ring, the stone the size of a small almond, surrounded by diamonds and set in platinum. "The Morgan emerald," Caroline breathed. "I never thought I'd see it again." "You recognize this?" Elizabeth asked, slipping the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly. "Richard gave it to me when he asked me to run away with him," Caroline explained. "It had been in the Morgan family for generations. When I left New York, Eleanor demanded its return. I complied, having no interest in Morgan heirlooms. How extraordinary that Catherine reclaimed it." The letter continued, "This ring represents our true heritage, not the Morgan wealth or status, but the love that created our family line. Wear it proudly, knowing you come from women who chose their own paths. When you're ready, find Caroline in Paris. Let her show you the world I couldn't share with you. Let her teach you about the art in your blood. Let her love you as the grandmother she truly is. All my love, now and always, Mom." Elizabeth clutched the letter to her heart, tears streaming down her face. Caroline embraced her, their shared grief and newfound connection washing over them in healing waves. Later that afternoon, they walked along the Seine, arm in arm, the Morgan emerald glinting on Elizabeth's hand in the Paris sunshine. "What will you do now?" Caroline asked gently. "Will you return to New York, to the Morgan estate?" Elizabeth considered the question. The inheritance, the mansion, the family name, all of it seemed hollow compared to what she had discovered in Paris. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time for me to learn who I really am beyond the Morgan legacy. I want to know about my true heritage. I want to learn about art and passion and living authentically." She squeezed Caroline's arm. "Will you teach me?" Caroline's face lit up with joy. "My dear, I've waited a lifetime for exactly that." 6 months later, Elizabeth stood in the grand ballroom of the Morgan estate, surveying the transformation. What had once been a sterile showcase of wealth was now filled with easels, each displaying a painting that told part of her family's true story. Caroline's vibrant landscapes and portraits hung alongside Catherine's more contemplative works and Elizabeth's own emerging artistic voice, 3 generations of Hayes women reclaiming their narrative. Tonight was the opening of Bloodlines, the Hayes Morgan Legacy, an exhibition Elizabeth had curated from Caroline's collection, her mother's hidden portfolio, and the Morgan family archives. The proceeds would establish the Catherine Hayes Foundation for Women in the Arts. "Miss Morgan, the first guests are arriving," Jeffrey announced, using the name Elizabeth still carried legally, though she now thought of herself differently. "Thank you, Jeffrey," she replied, adjusting the Morgan emerald on her finger. And please remember to introduce my grandmother to everyone. Of course, Miss. Mrs. Hayes is already greeting guests in the foyer. At 85, Caroline had become the sensation of the New York art world over the past months. After decades of recognition in Europe, her work was finally receiving its due in America, with the Metropolitan Museum of Art planning a retrospective for the following year. The exhibition opening had drawn Manhattan's elite old money families who had known the Morgans for generations, alongside celebrities and art world luminaries. They moved through the rooms of the mansion, champagne in hand, marveling at the 3 generations of artistic talent and the extraordinary story behind the works. Elizabeth watched from a distance as Caroline charmed a group that included the museum's chief curator and 2 movie stars. Her grandmother wore a stunning emerald green gown that complemented her silver hair, her posture still dancer straight, her hands animated as she described the inspiration behind a particularly dramatic seascape. "She's remarkable," said a deep voice beside Elizabeth. She turned to find herself face to face with Daniel Harrison, the journalist who had broken the story of Caroline Hayes's connection to the Morgan fortune. His article, published with Elizabeth's blessing in the New Yorker, had sent shockwaves through New York society and catapulted Caroline's work to new heights of recognition. "She is," Elizabeth agreed, "though I'm still not speaking to you about that Morgan heiress discovers secret grandmother headline. Far too sensational." Daniel laughed, his eyes crinkling attractively at the corners, yet entirely accurate. Besides, that headline helped make the exhibition the hottest ticket in town. Over the past months, Daniel had become a friend and occasional dinner companion as he worked on a book about Caroline's life and art. Elizabeth found herself increasingly drawn to his intelligence and lack of pretension, so different from the wealth-obsessed men she had dated in her Morgan heiress days. "Have you seen the guest list?" Daniel asked, lowering his voice. "Your grandfather's second wife is here." Elizabeth followed his gaze to where Marianne Morgan, now in her 70s, stood examining one of Caroline's early works, a portrait of Richard Morgan that captured both his charisma and the coldness in his eyes. "I invited her," Elizabeth said. "She's part of this story, too, and surprisingly supportive of the exhibition."